Hello, my name is Robert Varnham. I'm a GP in Manchester and Head of General Practice Development at NHS England. And I'd like to share some thoughts about the future of general practice, to describe some of the trends we're seeing in the emergence of new types of care and new types of organisation, to consider some of the evidence about common pitfalls and how we might overcome them. But first, I'd like us just to step back a moment and ask why it is everyone seems to be talking about change in general practice. I think it's fair to say that right across the country, people are talking about change in general practice. I've had the privilege of working with groups of practices all over the country and all over the world, and we're seeing that the same kind of questions are being asked, the same conclusions in many cases are being reached about the need for change. And they seem to come from two broad areas. One is common pressures, and the other is some common opportunities which face us. And I think it's helpful for us to see the two as linked and to see how we can move forward on the understanding that they are linked. Let's think about the pressures first of all. We've seen in British general practice over recent years a growing sense of pressure, and this is to do with growth in the volume of workload, growth in the complexity of our workload, but then also the fact that the funding and the workforce hasn't really kept pace with those growths. Other parts of the NHS have seen increases in funding and significant growth in the workforce, but in general practice we've seen those plateauing and in some cases falling. And so it's no surprise that general practices right now are feeling under great pressure. And it's good that action is starting at national level and regional level to make a difference to those pressures. But I think there's also something about the needs of the patients we serve that's really important for us to get our heads around. And it's this. You may have already seen this graph from the Scottish School of Primary Care, which shows that as we get older, the number of long-term conditions we have tends to go up. And so by the age of 75, about a third of people have 4 or more long-term conditions. And this speaks of a need for something fundamentally, qualitatively different from that which the NHS was assuming when it was established in 1948. Back then, you got ill. You saw a GP who gave you a prescription, cured you. After a period of convalescence, you go back to work. And at some future date, you might need the services of the NHS again. Obviously, sometimes you saw the GP who couldn't cure you, so would send you to a cleverer doctor who would give you a different prescription or cut off the offending article. You'd be cured. After a period of convalescence, you'd go back. And maybe at some future date, you would need the NHS again. Fast forward to 2016, and what we're seeing, shown by this graph, is that about half of our work is already being spent dealing with the needs of people who have multiple, interlinked, incurable long-term conditions. The paradigm has to change. We've already started doing bits of that. We've already been tinkering and doing workarounds. But I think increasingly people are saying change is necessary because the paradigm of care for this growing group of people in the population needs to change. And that has some important implications for the kind of care we provide and the kind of organisations that provide care. And there's some great real work going on. So people have moved on from this just being a theoretical or hypothetical discussion about the pressure and the opportunities that would help us meet the pressure. But it's actually getting quite real now. People are already innovating in the areas of new types of care, new types of organisation. A couple of years ago, NHS England launched something called the Call to Action on General Practice. And the purpose was firstly to find out what people were doing, what they were working for the future. And secondly, to understand what the system could do to spread and promote these innovations. And we heard about new types of care and new types of organisation. I think it's helpful just to look at some of the specifics there. On new types of care, people were saying fundamentally the vision of primary care and the principles of providing comprehensive, joined-up care in the heart of the community are really strong, and we want to make more of the contribution of general practice to realising that vision for the future. And so people were saying that they've been working on ways to improve access to general practice, to provide a different kind of care for long-term conditions that's more proactive, more coordinated. And then to rediscover some of the founding principles of general practice to do with prevention and health and well-being, not just picking up the pieces when people get ill. People also told us about lots of the specific things on the road to achieving that vision that they were implementing. And there's a huge list of them, just random selection of them is presented here. You may know some of these already. You may be doing some of this work already. And it's certainly really exciting to see how much is already happening and how well it's going in most parts of the country. But it's also telling to see how many of these good opportunities, new innovations, which do a better job for patients and the population and could free up some pressure from general practice, require us to work differently and to work in different ways with a much wider group of people than has traditionally been the case. If you're just providing one-off cures for single episodes of care, the Dr. Finlay model in 1948 works quite well. Now, it's just really not very appropriate, clinically or organisationally, to be sticking with that kind of way of working. So people are doing quite a lot of work to talk about new kinds of organisations. And I think that's very interesting as well, but I think there are some huge pitfalls here. The three commonest questions I get asked about this wider primary care, this more at-scale working, are these. Firstly, what size should we be? Secondly, what kind of structure or legal underpinnings, what legal entity should we have? And thirdly, a slightly vaguely worded set of questions about saying, we've formed a federation. What now? What do we do? Why have we formed a federation? What's the purpose of it? And we're seeing evidence about some of these questions emerging from large programmes like the Prime Minister's GP Access Fund or the Vanguard programme. I'd like to share some examples of what it is we're seeing. Let's think about size first of all. The GP Access Fund is now in its second year, and we've seen a huge gamut in terms of the size of collaborations involved. They've ranged from 2, 3 or 4 practices right up to 300 to 400. And we've seen some huge strengths of being small. Let's consider that first of all. Some of the strengths of being small we've seen are it's much easier and quicker to achieve clarity about what you're doing. So you get a contract to do a piece of work. We've seen that the smaller groupings of practices have achieved a clear plan that everyone understands relatively quickly. Crucially, they've also got good commitment from all of their participating practices relatively quickly and easily. So if the plan says that from Thursday we're doing this new service, then broadly speaking, from Thursday they've done that new service. Very impressive. Thirdly, they've found that they've got greater agility to adjust plans when they need to. So, for example, when by Thursday afternoon you realise something needs to change about the plan, it's easier to contact everyone and say, should we change it, and get the buy-in and get it started. So some huge benefits about being small. Maybe that's a challenge for you. Maybe you need to be thinking about working in quite a small collaboration. But let's look to the larger end of the scale. We're seeing some very big benefits of being large, but they're different. So the first thing we're seeing at the large end is that these groupings of sort of 50, 100, 200 practices, they're much more clearly aligned with other things happening in their local system. They're much more joining in with changes in the hospital sector or in social care or the health and well-being agenda. Secondly, their priorities are much more clearly informed by the whole system priorities. So that's a real strength in terms of getting the biggest value for your effort and your money when you're aligned and you're sharing priorities. But also, these larger groups have found it easier to form successful strategic partnerships with people like AHSNs and hospitals and the voluntary sector and local authorities. Working at scale, you're more credible. It's easier for those organisations to have one meeting with an organisation that represents 100 practices than to have 100 meetings with 100 different practices. So, tremendous benefits and really attractive benefits of being very large. So which should you choose, small or large? Well, I think the conclusion we're drawing, and it starts off being a challenging one, but I hope is liberating eventually for you, is this, that surely you'd want the benefits of both ends of the spectrum. You'd want all of the features of being small and all of the good features about being large as well. And if that's the case, I think we're starting to see people come up with a great solution, which is of nesting their at-scale arrangements. Instead of having one size fits all, to choose the scale to meet the particular issue. You might think of it as a bit of a Russian doll approach. So people are saying some things would work better if we weren't just one practice, but we were practices representing 50,000 patients, for example. 50 to 100,000 seems a good number for a locality. We can do lots of things much better at that sort of scale, employ new staff, do premises better, all the rest of it. But actually some things probably happen better at an even larger scale. Quite hard to do some big things about workforce or innovation or IT changes if you're anything smaller than 1 million or 2 million patients probably. But then crucially, often people are saying, do you know, for some things, for an interest of our patients, they need us to be smaller. And so they're also saying, well, for some things, can we build sub-teams of 1 or 2 GPs and folk built around them? And we're getting comfortable with the idea of blurring some of these boundaries, of collaborating at different sizes for different purposes. So it could be that the answer to your question about size, should we be big, should we be small, is yes. Let's think about the next question about what structure, what legal entity we should have. And the GP Access Fund is showing some interesting learning about that as well. It's included groups who've gone all the way from being a loose association of practices through more formal networks and federations to having some super practices, single merged organisations. Some of the things we've been learning are that actually you can make the care work almost irrespective of some of the organisational considerations. It's possible to do an awful lot through being a super practice. It's also possible to do an awful lot through being an association of practices. So an example from the Vanguard's programme is the Whitstable Medical Practice. A history here of merging practices as a means to get more done, to get some efficiencies of scale, to make it easier to serve the population in exciting new ways. So through mergers, they've been able to do some great stuff with community-based diagnostics and partnerships with the voluntary sector that are better for patients and better for the practices as well, demedicalising care. And for them, merging has been very successful at achieving that. Another example from London is of the AT Medics group of practices. Here we've got groups of practices who do operate independently, and in some respects they've got independent character and different local flavour to them. It's a very local approach. But illustration here in the photograph is of their single approach to dealing with protocols in reception. They're shared, they're pooled across all their practices. It's a common approach and they're all trained in the same way. And for them, being a single partnership has enabled them to do that. But we're also seeing some far looser associations, networks and federations of practices in the GP Access Fund who have been doing some astonishing work on shared working, real progress being made on pooling staff, sharing training, having common procedures, doing one piece of work once and spreading it out everywhere. And those things have all happened, great collaborations, almost irrespective of the organisational form. So that might free you up a little to think about what kind of organisational form you could have. And I think it lets all of us, whatever our current state, think differently about where we're at. We're a federation, we're a network, we've got some collaboration going for an awful lot of practices. Where now? I think it encourages us to get the order right. Not to put form before function, but to start by asking what's our purpose, then get some functions going and some new ways of working, and then to build, eventually, a form that serves us well. So how could we actually do that change? Well, I think the NHS change model could be very helpful. This is everything we know about successful change in one place. Lots of different components of change you need to have going on to succeed, but at the heart of it is having a clear sense of our shared purpose. What would it look like for us as groups of practices if we were to build on that principle, if we were to put our shared purpose at the heart and ask the right questions in the right order? I think it might look like this. I think we'd start by saying, who is us? What's the group of practices? Who are the other providers that would make sense to be in this collaboration. Secondly, what do we actually want to achieve? What do our patients need? What does our population need from us? What's it going to need in the next 5, 10, 15 years' time? What opportunities do we see to do things differently, do things better? Why would we collaborate together? And then, once we've got that, to ask what capabilities would we need? Do we need some new people? Do we need some new management, some new buildings, some new information? Probably we need all of those things. But being clear about those on the basis of what we want to achieve is probably the better order for asking these questions. Next, how should we lead and how should we go about working together? And here I think we can allow ourselves a period of experimentation. Test it out. There's no one way of doing many of these things. Why not try several of them? See which works best for you. Allow some flexibility and the things to settle in before we fix them into an organisational form of a new federational structure or something like that. And lastly, I do actually think it is necessary for us to be thinking about new organisational forms. Partly that's because it can provide the infrastructure that makes all of this collaborative working more sustainable. Secondly, I think it could bring us some economies of scale. And thirdly, it's probably the only way that the NHS is going to be able to contract with us. Very hard to have 100 contracts to do a single piece of work, much easier to have a single one. So most commissioners find that very attractive. But if we reach that point, having got the relationships built on a sound purpose for the future, I think that's going to help us out of many of the pitfalls that people can fall into. Maybe you've fallen into some of them already. I think we can get out by just going back to basics, start at the beginning, asking different questions. Very quickly, there's one other question I hope is in your mind by now, and it's this: how on earth are we going to find the time for all this change? And I think that's a really important one for us to be asking ourselves at a national level and at a local level. You'll have seen that work has already begun at a national level to invest more in general practice and to release some pressure and some burdens in general practice. And Simon Stevens, when announcing the new GP contract for this year, said that this is the first action of many. We're going to need to do a whole basket of things to help release the pressure. And there's some things like that can only happen nationally. But there are some things that practices themselves are telling us they can do themselves to work differently and free up some staff capacity. And we've grouped them together into what we're calling the 10 high impact actions to release capacity in our practices. If you're interested in that, I really encourage you to have a look at the new discussion forum that's been formed to share case studies of real examples of where practices have made a success of this and to ask about how you can make a success of it yourself. I think without that, all of these visions for the future could be quite difficult to realise. So, I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's been challenging to take stock, but also useful to reframe some of the questions we've been asking about the future of general practice. I hope it gives you some new questions and some new tools for you to make a real success of all of this. Good luck with it.